the most inappropriate thing you've witnessed at a funeral? Story 1. My father's funeral. After the service and the reception after, my mother, brother, and sister headed back to our family home. A bunch of my father's siblings and their family were also staying at the house with us. We got home a few minutes before everyone else. I was sitting at a table in the living room when I could see their cars come down the driveway. They all got out and were hugging and seemingly congratulating each other. The reception after the service was beautifully put together and was actually a fun time. A fitting send-off for my father. So I assumed they were still just having fun from that, until they came inside. They all came in together very quickly and quietly. They came up to me and my older brother sitting at the table and kind of crowded around like a bunch of kids, about to see if they could have a cookie before dinner. My Aunt Barbara smugly stood at the front and asked, "So when are we going to be doing the reading of the will to see what was left to us all?" My brother and I just looked at each other for a few moments before we turned to them to say, "Are you kidding? Reading of the will? Like a soap opera?" There is no reading of the will. Everything that belonged to my father now just belongs to my mother. The look of defeat, but not shame, was disgustingly transparent. They were supposed to stay another few nights. They packed up and left that afternoon. Edit. I made up my name on the spot. Not my comments. You can take the 2 seconds to click on it and see for yourself. Story 2. My own kids, boys ages 10 and 8. At their great-grandfather's wake, they got a chair and moved it to the casket and started making his mouth into smiley face, laughing the whole time. When me and their grandfather, my father-in-law, saw it, I immediately pulled them away and told them they shouldn't do that. Grandpa laughed and said, "It's fine. He would have really loved that they did that." We later found out that the great-grandfather had asked the funeral home ahead of time to put a sign in his hand that said, "Thanks for coming," but they refused. Story 3. At my grandpa's funeral in 2006, a random drunk woman that no one in our family knew stumbled in and started singing show tunes, then crying till she was escorted out. Story 4. An estranged uncle driving past my grandmother's funeral playing "Another One Bites the Dust." Edit. To everyone apologizing for laughing or whatever, please don't. It's no longer a sore point for me or my family. That uncle was suffering from a mental breakdown due to drug abuse and a high-pressure job, and that combination eventually took its toll. It makes it easier to deal with than if he was just being a spiteful, as we thought at the time. Story 5. My step-grandmother died a few months before the Borat movie came out, so everyone was in full-blown Borat mode. Someone's phone went off and their ringtone was, "Throw the Jew down the well." Edit. She, as well as most of the people attending the funeral, were all Jewish. Story 6. Only somewhat inappropriate, but certainly the funniest thing. It was a funeral for an uncle I was very distantly related to, and, this is happening in Greece in the summer, the church is very full and incredibly hot. You can smell the sweat, there's incense, the air isn't circulating, and the priest is just going on and on. I don't think I can describe how grim the situation was. Not totally unexpectedly, therefore, just as the priest is getting to something particularly emotional, a man, an old colleague standing near the back faints. He's completely out. Now, this guy was very tall and rather broad, so not only was it a miracle that he didn't take out the 2 tiny old ladies right in front of him, he was also really difficult to carry outside to get some air. Somebody has the brilliant idea that the pallbearers, those people who carry the casket, should carry him, since they've practiced it and are reasonably strong. So everybody squeezes a bit tighter, nobody wants to leave the church, things just got interesting, to let them through. They pick him up, 3 on one side and 3 on the other, i.e. more or less as they would the casket, and start carrying him towards the door. Suddenly, this guy wakes up, turns his head several times, grasps what's going on and who's carrying him faster than anybody can respond, and immediately starts yelling, "I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive-y!" At which point, one of the pallbearers laughs so hard that he drops what was thankfully a leg, and the others struggle to put him down in what is now a church absolutely exploding with laughter. The whole situation went on for a good 15 minutes in which this guy walked outside and the priest tried to resume the service, but there absolutely continued to be giggles throughout. I, being a teenager at the time, also couldn't possibly hold it back every time I thought of this guy yelling, "He's alive." Nobody was even particularly upset because the uncle we were burying was always laughing and joking around, so it somehow felt appropriate that we had a great laugh at his funeral. Edit. My first award. Thanks so much. Glad to put some laughter into this thread. Story 7. At my grandma's funeral. There was a woman that had a really bad relationship with my grandma, but one of my aunts invited her to the funeral. She started receiving people as if she was a family member and tried to put herself at the center of everything. Story 8. At a family friend's funeral, a man I allegedly met when I was 3 came up behind me, pulled my head back by placing his hand on my neck, and told me that I might not remember him now, but I will someday. That creepy old dick fart. Story 9. At an open casket wake, a friend of the deceased attempted to give her a drink of single malt whiskey. She ended up being forcibly removed as she wouldn't stop and spilled a lot of the alcohol in the casket. It was as horrible and inappropriate as it was heartbreaking for everyone. Story 10. A relative of my husband died. There was a gathering at her house after the funeral, hosted by her husband. It was mostly family of my husband, but there were a few friends. There was catered food and drink, and people were just general socializing and telling nice stories about the deceased. About 2 hours in, a man and woman in their mid-20s show up. They are acquaintances of the widower. They walk around the house a bit, grab a drink, and then disappear. I was asked to get some more drinks from the garage, which was off the kitchen. I opened the door and stepped into the garage. There was the young couple, leaning against a car and engaging in some pretty vigorous sexual relations. Another family member who was standing in the kitchen saw what I saw. I backed out of the garage because I was fairly embarrassed. I mean, who does that at a funeral? I guess the other relative told the widower because the next thing I know there is shouting from the garage and the widower is telling these two people in no uncertain terms that they needed to leave. Apparently, not only were they having in the garage, but they were doing lines of coke off the hood of the car. Only a few people who were at the gathering found out what happened, thank goodness. Story 11. I was at my then-boyfriend's friend's funeral. Her aunt sat with me at the back and told me that she spontaneously lubricates at funerals. Scooched away real quick. Story 12. I witnessed the estranged, drunk and druggy daughter of a family friend come screaming into the visitation, looking for her brothers because she had found out she was never written into the will. It was a of a scene. Edits. I had to actually ask because people brought up good points. This was in Missouri, Misty, an affirmative disinheriting state. The will, according to brother number 1, said she was actively excluded from the official will and entitled to no portion of the estate, named her ex-husband a portion of the home sale. Brother number 2 bought his father out and kept it, and the remaining estate to both of her sons. The daughter was allowed personal effects, hence the police when getting them, probably to ensure she didn't try and swipe anything else. His mother had handwritten an unofficial one to be read to her children. Also, Ash had every chance to get clean between 16, 18, and 27. Both parents were more than willing and able to pay for treatment. She actively chose not to, as well as actively chose not to seek treatment for whatever was going on in her life that caused her to turn to drugs as a way to cope. She wasn't even going to come to the funeral until she checked with the lawyer Yaf the day of and flipped. Story 13. Not super inappropriate, but my grandfather was always a trickster. He had a great sense of humor. He had this little song he would sing to me, my siblings, and my little cousins where he would just repeat the words, poo-poopy-doo, over and over. At his funeral, my aunt was telling stories about him, and in the middle of her telling a story, my 6-year-old cousin screamed, poo-poopy-doo, in front of 50 people. Needless to say, it lightened the mood a little bit and made everyone a little happier remembering him in a good way. Edit. For people asking, it's not the Betty Boop song. Story 14. Not a funeral, but my grandmother was on her deathbed. She was going in and out of consciousness. My father and his sister start arguing over who will get her wedding ring. Not for sentimental value, but because they wanted to sell it. Anyway, to make a long story short, they took the ring off and their mother came out of consciousness and the first thing she said was, "Where is my ring?" Fucking scumbags. Story 15. The mother of the deceased putting on a terribly acted and meth-fueled show about how much she loved and missed her daughter. Shortly thereafter, she was convicted of the daughter's murder. Story 16. My brother-in-law's girlfriend locked herself in a car, cried and screamed, threatening to kill herself. At my father-in-law's funeral. She was fine 5 minutes later and explained to my in-law she did it because she's not used to not having all the attention. She thought her being pregnant would make people forget that the father died. Story 17. My best friend died last year from a random heart failure at 25. The pastor at the funeral went on for about 10 minutes about how we had all killed him because we were sinners and that we should join his church to make amends. He didn't know any of us. It was very uncomfortable. Story 18. At my grandfather's funeral, the stand-in, curmudgeonly pastor kept calling my grandfather by the wrong name. Pastor. We are here to memorialize the life of John Smith. Pastor. John Smith lived a good life. I had never personally met John Smith, but my spouse loudly. Well, I've never met John Smith either. His name was Bob White. Everyone attending burst out laughing. Story 19. The priest, repeatedly, referred to my grandmother by the wrong name. After the fourth or fifth time, my aunt got up and quietly told him the correct name. My grandmother had attended church weekly for decades. There was no reason for the priest to not know his parishioner. Needless to say, we did not pay his fee. Story 20. My cousin's funeral. He was 27 years old and killed in a single car crash after he hit a slippery patch on the road and smashed into a concrete wall. At his funeral, all of his brothers, sisters, and parents sat on the front row at his graveside service. Then, lo and behold, my cousin's ex-girlfriend of over a year shows up and immediately inserts herself onto the front row next to his sisters, and proceeds to scream cry, scream wail, and throw herself on the ground periodically throughout the service. All of the family just gave her awkward stares, with no one wanted to address her inappropriate behavior. I had never seen that type of attention demanding drama queen antics before. Or since. Edit. Just wanted to throw this in. This was a funeral with military honors, Air Force, and they did the gun salute at the gravesite. I don't remember how many times they fire, but at each gunshot she would literally shriek and collapse into the arms of either of the sisters standing next to her. I do recall at the very end, the youngest sister was sick of that and just let her fall on the ground. And it was raining heavily and rather muddy. Story 21. My sister's elderly FIL found out he had cancer and shot himself in the head. He wasn't one bit religious, but her husband, his son, had joined the Mormon church and decided on his own that the funeral services should be held there. The Mormon minister, who had never met the deceased, proceeded to hold everyone but me and my spouse captive for well over an hour while he described in minute detail why we should all join his church and become Mormons. We got up and walked out on the sales pitch after 20 minutes. Fucking. Story 22. My ex came back from her grandfather's funeral. I had to work. With family reunion pictures of herself, her siblings, and her parents, posing next to the open casket. When I casually commented that I thought it was a little off, she explained that they did so because Grandma otherwise wouldn't believe he died. Story 23. Picture, if you will, two elderly women in a funeral squaring up as people are still crying from the ceremony. At the lunch after my grandpa's funeral, his daughter from a previous marriage, Dee, who no one had seen in years, showed up. Dee had been writing bad checks all the way to the state prison and had definitely had some unresolved beef with my family when she got out. The last time my mom saw her was when was 11 and Dee left her infant daughter for my mom to babysit and never came back. Fast forward to the funeral, Dee is acting like it's a family reunion, but no one is having it since she's basically screwed everyone in the room in one way or another. My grandpa's last girlfriend, a legally blind woman, tried to physically fight her until others stepped in. Edit. Gave my crazy half-aunt a pseudonym for clarity. Edit 2. The baby left with my mom at age 11 was not me, but that would be an amazing plot twist. Dee had said she was just having a night out and actually decided to run off to San Francisco, this was the early 70s, and left her baby. When Dee didn't come back, my mom called her mom, got a hold of a relative that took care of the baby until Dee could be reached. Sorry, I don't have a lot of details after that, but the baby grew up and she actually arrived at the funeral with Dee. And I hear the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Edit 3. I had forgotten this part somehow. After the funeral, Dee tried to steal the car willed to Grandpa's blind boo. But my family thought ahead, and a couple of my uncles waited around the house until Dee came for the car. They came outside, and apparently she was scared off. Blind boo got the car in the end and wrecked it immediately. I can't make this up. Story 24. I guess it's not totally inappropriate given who had died, but a group of guys lit up a fat joint at a funeral I went to in HS. I guess it was his smoking buddies, but it didn't go over that well. Story 25. Was at the funeral of a priest once. He was so well liked in the church, not only were there dozens of other priests, but something like 2 or 3 bishops. More than half of the people had to stand outside of the church and listen via loudspeaker. Kind of hard when the neighbor of the cemetery plays anti-church and anti-God songs loud enough to hear nothing else. I'm absolutely not religious and usually listen to exactly the same music as well, but holy cow, that was inappropriate. Especially because the guy got up at around 8 a.m. on a Sunday, JST so he could with people. Story 26. At my great-grandmother's funeral, her son showed up to the funeral wearing khakis and his bright orange Tennessee Vols shirt. Then he started yelling at my mom when she asked him who the pallbearers were going to be, mainly throwing a fit about who was in the will. Mind you, we hadn't even left the funeral home yet and were literally needing to know who they would be at that very moment. Needless to say, we don't talk to that side of the family anymore. Story 27. Oh, my time to shine. Former mortuary industry worker. The worst is hard to call because I've seen a lot. Some honorable mentions. A rando walking on off the street and proceeding to help herself to coffee and oating in our bathroom. Didn't die. Did get Narcaned. A couple fooling around in the urn casket showroom during the viewing. An angry old woman storming out of the bathroom with a fistful of tampons, screaming about how inappropriate we were for keeping them in there, because there are children here. She threw them at the funeral director's face. They were kept in a cabinet in a small basket, well hidden from public view. She was definitely rifling around to have found them. We were no longer allowed to keep our sanitary products in the restrooms after this. A grief-stricken mother tipping her son's casket while wailing and trying to climb inside. Less inappropriate than it was terribly sad. Caught a junkie relative digging deep into the pockets of the deceased looking for the family and is assumed money. A woman pulling down her child's pants and letting it in a potted plant. The funeral homeowner's horrible dog sashaying up to the front and taking a giant liquid in front of the casket and horrified guests in the middle of the service. The same dog biting someone at another service. Tons of brawls, lots of drinking. Biker funerals were insane. The women were meaner than and fighting one another constantly. The dudes were awesome though, super respectful, cleaned the place up perfectly and even hauled their trash away, most of which was bags of beer cans and liquor bottles. I loved biker funerals. I have some, so many. But I'll stop here. Story 28. One of my best friends died in September. There were some questionable circumstances surrounding his death, in that we were all pretty sure it was drug-related, heroin. Anyways, the guy that got him into the stuff, who shot him up the night he died, showed up to the funeral. Hi. I could have killed him. Story 29. Not sure if this counts as inappropriate, but when my high school classmate died, we were already in college IRC. His ex, also high school classmate, came to the funeral. She cried so dramatically, because she wasn't able to end things with our dead HS classmate on a good note, that guests thought she was the current SOGF that time. Current SOGF was left alone, sitting alone, staring blankly at the casket, while relatives, John friends, HS classmates comfort the ex. Also, it got to the point that the boyfriend, can't recall if he attended or just got word of what happened, of that girl during that time got jealous and got angry because it looked like she cared more for the dead than him. Posted a rant on social media. Edit. Fixed pronouns, since I'm bad constructing TLDR. During my college years, high school classmate died. His ex came to the funeral and cried dramatically, looking like she's the GF, and current GF was ignored during her sobbing. BF of the ex that time was furious. Story 30. My mom and sister were smoking weed at my cousin's funeral. He was only 16 when he died, so there were lots of kids there as well. My mom also wanted to surprise everyone by sending clowns to said funeral, who were going to paint butterflies on their faces because my cousin died of epidermolysis bullosa, known as butterflies disease. Story 31. My grandma died a few years ago, and we decided on a burial. After the interment ceremony, the groundskeeper asked us if we would like to leave before they finished packing the dirt. My family said no. Cut to us horrifically watching my grandma's casket get repeatedly dirt punched by an excavator. It was more disturbing than inappropriate. Edit. A letter. Story 32. Maybe isn't as over the top as most of these comments, but I'm one of the Marines that has to go present the flag to the next of kin when a service member dies. It's usually old Vietnam and Korea vets, but sometimes it's a Desert Storm or a recent war vet, and the mother is there receiving the flag instead of a son or daughter. Point is, I've probably been to 45 funerals in the past year. It's striking how often someone's phone goes off during the service. It seems nearly every other or every third service someone's ringtones start playing. There's been a few times where someone will get up from their seat and answer the phone too. Story 33. At my great-aunt's funeral in rural Missouri. Open casket. Small country church. The pastor says my great-aunt's dying wish was for one more person to embrace the teachings of Jesus Christ and to stand up right now and receive baptism in front of God and his congregation. Everybody's head swiveled in my direction, except the corpses. Nope. I'll just stare up at the ceiling for a while, guys. Thanks. Story 34. I know a little boy who said his first word during the moment of silence at a funeral. Time to drop a toy and clearly say, shit. In context, right? Ripples of laughter went through the hall, like 200 people were at this funeral. Not a single person scowled or told me off, and one older lady came up to me and said, "You can be assured she would have laughed the loudest. She probably still is. That was quite the chuckle we all got." Special thanks to my oil-field husband and my father for their chronic use of said word that led to this moment with my eldest loinfruit. Story 35. When my dad's mom passed away, there were a lot of people there. He comes from a family of 11. 10 now, as his sister passed away a while ago. So there were a lot of nieces, nephews, and cousins. It was an open casket. I was around 12, 13. But everyone was grabbing things from her, off her from the casket, all the aunts grabbing things for their kids who don't even know her. Remember who she is? Way too young. The only thing my dad has a keepsake of his mother is a little rose pin that she wore in the home she was in before she passed. It's unfortunate and makes me feel very sad for my dad. Story 36. I've mentioned it before, but at the wake for my very young sister, my aunt started talking to me about how she was going to write children's books and gave me a pen with her contact information on it. I'm not sure what she wanted, but I write and edit, and I was working on an English degree, and we barely ever see her, so I took it as self-promotion, not offering ways to reach out. My mom threw the pen away. Story 37. A marriage proposal to the recently widowed. She accepted. Edit. Reddit is thirsty for drama. Sorry, but you will be disappointed. I know this is a thing in some families where, if a guy dies, a single, male, relative of the deceased will end up marrying the widow. Why this is a thing I don't know, but no it is. So, the divorced brother proposed to his deceased brother's wife, and she said yes. I doubt there was any cheating going on there. The two are still happily married as well. Story 38. A narcissistic family member arrived late, after everyone else was at the graveside for the burial, and probably lurking behind a tomb to pick the perfect time after the priest had just started talking. Wearing an enormous hat and sunglasses and low-cut gown like she was attending the Golden Globes red carpet or something, and loudly making an absolute scene of how devastated she was. Darlings, and just generally making it all about her. Story 39. I walk up to the casket to pay my respects at my grandma's funeral. My cousin walks up at the same time, and as we are both crying, she says, "It's just crazy to believe that 2 weeks ago Grandma and I were smoking a joint in your kitchen together." What? Story 40. I went to my uncle's funeral with my dad, sister, and friends. My father was already hammered, and my idiot friends dressed in t-shirts and shorts. To top it off, my cousin wore the skimpiest top to her own dad's funeral. My father, wasted, was hitting on his own sister-in-law. My cousin ended up inviting us to smoke medical marijuana in her car. It was a disaster. Story 41. My grandmother's funeral was on her birthday. I purchased happy birthday balloons because it was what she would have wanted. I was immediately reprimanded by my mother when I arrived as she forgot it was her birthday. But everyone that knew the family knew that she would have loved it. Even my grandfather laughed when I walked in with them. Story 42. Need to preface this with a little information on a regional thing from where I am. I live in Northwest Ontario, and we have these events called shags. It is a combination stag and shower for couples getting married. You sell admission tickets, 2 for $5. They take place in halls and guests buy booze, tickets for prizes, etc. The money raised goes to help the couple start their lives together. And full disclosure, they are a hell of a good time. So on to my actual story, not a funeral, but my grandmother was on her deathbed at the hospital. Extended family was coming and going to say their goodbyes. My dad's cousin came by and did the usual, "I'm sorry, thoughts are with you," etc. Sadness all around. Then this cousin of my dad's starts to ask everyone if they want to buy tickets to his upcoming. We are in her hospital room, watching her slowly die, And this, who is in his 50s and way past the acceptable age to even be holding is asking people to buy tickets off him for his. Idiot didn't take the hints when everyone kept saying, no, not right now, just kept asking. I am not a violent man, but at that point I was as close as I have ever been to cold cocking someone. 5 years later, this still angers us. Edit. As many people can't get over that can mean something different in a different part of the world. This link may help a bit. Story 43. This was inadvertently inappropriate and kind of a funny story that happened at my friend's dad's funeral. His dad had just died of cancer after fighting for a few years, and me and another friend went to funeral to pay our respects and be there for the family. We got there a little early and met up with my friend, his girlfriend, and his brother saw a girlfriend in the church's entryway. There was a wedding finishing up in there, so we had to wait, and we just stood there waiting to set things up. The wedding finally lets out, and we see the guests rolling out, followed by the wedding party. All of the bridesmaids and groomsmen were dressed in full Adidas tracksuits and sneakers. Then the bride and groom make their appearance, and she is wearing a pink wedding dress with a pair of Adidas and a track jacket over the dress. The groom is wearing a white Adidas tracksuit with a matching. They both walk out hand in hand doing the sea walk dance and trying to hand us these party poppers, which we politely declined. I think they saw the memorial posters and realized that we were there for a funeral because they stopped dancing, straightened up, and hurried outside. I looked at my friend and we couldn't help but laugh at the situation. Those people were doing their thing and having fun, and it certainly lightened the mood of a very sad day, which is what his dad would have wanted. Story 44. My grandmother spent the last decade and a half of her life in a nursing home with severe Alzheimer's and depression after being kicked out of 2 other places previously for trying to kill herself. Her last years were of weary terror, not remembering her children that would visit when they could, and would ask only where her mother was, and breaking down in tears when she inevitably realized what was going on, as little as she could. She lived mostly as a result of modern pharmacology and medical science with little to no quality of life. Before she passed, she'd agreed to have a priest from the church she grew up in come in and say a few words. Keep in mind this arrangement was made nearly 15 years before she passed. On the day of her funeral, the big news story was the court battle over Terry Schiavo and the right of family to keep her on life support versus her husband's wishes, desires to remove her from it. For those that don't remember, the church got involved and made a major thing about how taking her off life support was akin to murder. Feeling the need to opine, the priest, who had never met her and knew nothing about her, took the cue and spent 10 minutes talking about how life support is part of God's plan and removing people from it is murder, and that the concept of euthanasia was legalizing genocide. He talked about how the Nazis' extermination of the Jews was like what was going on in Florida, and how if God saw fit to grant us life, then it's our obligation to accept it as a gift no matter the circumstances. The room was a level of deafening silence as no one could believe what words had just been spoken, what concepts had been advocated, what disconnect from the situation had been demonstrated. A man of the cloth was supposed to be there to comfort us in a time of distress, and had instead insisted that the decades of pain and suffering of this poor woman were righteous and God's will, and how dare anyone should question whether mercy should have been granted to her. Never have I had to restrain myself more from getting up and physically removing someone from a room. When he was done, I stood up ready to go after him and felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "Let me handle this," was all he said, and walked up to the priest and let him out. All I remember is hearing the priest say something to the effect of, "Is there a problem? There's still more I'm supposed to do," as he was being almost lifted off the floor by his arm and escorted out a door as my mom wept. The only thing I could think of was that she was denied the ability to have any dignity in her death, and was now being deprived it even after her passing. A short while later, her casket was lowered into the ground next to her husband, who had passed 30 years before her. It was done without incident and without the priest. Story 45. A good friend of mine OD'd. We used to hang out a lot, then she just stopped coming around. Few months later, found out she had died. Went to the funeral, the guy that got her into all the drugs and stuff was there. We could put something in the casket if we wanted. He went up and put a Hatchet Man sticker on her coffin. Fucking ICP, Hatchet Man, and the cause of her death, seriously? I fucking wanted to murder him right then and there. I was 17 at the time. Story 46. We went out to dinner after my dad's funeral. I had snagged one of his hoodies from his closet and I was wearing it. My brother noticed and kind of sarcastically said, "Hey, nice jacket." I said, "Thanks, I got it off a dead guy." Story 47. I worked at a cemetery one summer when I was in high school. This usually involved mowing, shots, weed eating, but they also had me help on the setup, touch, tear down of burial equipment. The worst I saw was just a screaming argument that appeared to be sibling upset one took advantage of their now deceased mother. The most interesting thing was observing how culturally different groups handled the burial. White families always left right after the preacher was finished, so we would lower the coffin with everyone gone. Black families always stayed until the dirt started going on top. Only had one Asian funeral, and it was a cremation. Story 48, my partner's stepmom's funeral. I was standing next to my partner to support him when one of his distant relatives, before even giving condolences or a greeting or anything else, asked, "Are you two married?" "No." "Oh, but you're together?" "Yes." What a shame. The same woman then approached us at the wake and started going on about how nice it was to see young love blossom after a family breakup and how exotic I was. I'm Asian, he's white, because my partner had broken up with the mother of his child. She heavily implied that I was just a rebound and that he would be back to his normal self soon. When my partner corrected her and told her that we had been together for 5 years, she visibly became uncomfortable and said, "Oh, how nice." Story 49. So they were walking with the casket, and the son was one off the pallbearers. Obviously emotional. The ex-husband was in attendance and was a bit of a... He stands up, punches his son in the back of the head, and tells him to man up. She's dead after all. Stop being a... The son looses it and says, "That's it. Fuck this man," throwing what's in his hands to the ground and walks off. Of course, what was in his hands was the casket. Story 50. A kid doing a Fortnite dance. It was a relative of my mother who died. He was a nice guy who worked hard and helped people outside along. Comes his nephew, and instead of paying his respects or just standing like a normal human, he gets right next to the coffin and does a Fortnite dance. This made me think genocidal thoughts. Story 51. My grandmother, 52 at the time, died due to a botched surgery where they cut a major artery by accident and she bled out. Her mother was in her late 70s and could not believe she lost her daughter. She was showing early signs of dementia before this, and her death didn't help. During the eulogy, my great-grandmother jumped up and said, "She blinked. I saw it. She's not dead," and attempted to run up and pull her from the coffin. Story 52. I had a guy that I don't know walk up behind me and my dad during my grandma's funeral. They were lowering the casket at that moment. This put his arms around both of us and I looked back. Everyone was wearing black, obviously, except this. He was wearing American flag pajama bottoms and a red shirt with the sleeves cut off. He looks at both of us and says, "Cheer up, guys." My dad and I are not violent, but we had to eye-talk each other down from turning around and dual-punching me on the jaw. I know. Not the most inappropriate thing ever, but at that moment, it felt like it. Stupid. Story 53. Grandson of the deceased was straight out of I Am Very Smart. Anyways, he had a beat-up old Trailblazer, held together only with the rust between the wheel wells. The only thing he was talking about to anyone who would listen, including the recently widowed and incredibly sad grandmother, was the massive 3 bajillion megawatt speakers he put in the back for like 30 grand. To everyone's dismay, he insisted on showing them off. He ran out to the parking lot and hooked up his phone to the car. Sure enough, some electronic dance techno music started blaring, but you could only truly hear some distorted garbage. Don't worry, folks, it only lasted a few seconds. Remember how the car was only held together by the collective rust between the wheel wells? Well, the rust finally gave way to the horrible sound waves, and before the funeral directors could reach him to tell him how disrespectful he was being, his car had shook a bunch of rust off, and several pieces of trim had fallen off, including one of the windows falling off the tracks. Most people could see, though no one went outside with him. He was parked by one of the big bay windows.